I've been ready since Wednesday.
All right,
Beginning.
you ready to go?
Let's
All right.
go.
All right, so thank you everybody for being here. It's wonderful to kind of share what Alex has been up to. So Alex started contacting me about 3 years ago with a lot of interest in evolution. He comes with a biology science degree from Rowan University, and we had a overlap in terms of interest in evolution, and some of the work he will talk about today kind of dives into some evolution questions that people have had in the past but haven't been able to answer. So it's pretty cool. But before he was able to get into the evolutionary questions, we had to develop some other kind of frameworks or data, computational biology type of data sets. So Alex has come on and really developed a lot of strengths in plant ecology, computational biology, and it's been a lot of fun conversations over the past couple of years to get to this point, and I'm really excited to hear what he has to say about this kind of framework that he developed. And I think there'll be time for some questions, everything, but you also have a lot of results to kind of cover, and it's pretty fun. So I'll introduce Alex Kirsch and defining plant ecological specialists and generalists, building a framework for identification and classification. Okay.
So like Dr. Kaproff said, there was a lot of work that went into this in a lot of different disciplines, that being evolutionary, lots of coding, computational science, things like that. But before we can really talk about anything, we have to talk a little bit about what specialization and generalization are. And at the broadest level, these are terms that you would use to describe species or groups of species to say something about their ecological strategy. So you might say that a species is specialized if it has a really narrow function in the environment, and a generalized species has a more broadly applicable role in the environment. And these two terms are more or less opposite to one another, forming a spectrum, and most species probably fall somewhere in the middle between these two things. But a lot of scientists like to use these terms as a binary system where you are either a specialist or a generalist. And that's kind of problematic, and we're going to talk about why that is in a bit. But looking a little bit more closely, what are these specialists and generalists thought to possess? So they will usually have either one or more, a few different things. Specialists are thought to have really restricted habitats and restricted resource utilization. They are thought to have very particular anatomy that is only good for a small number of things. They are usually more reliant on co-evolutionary relationships with other members of their ecological network, and they're thought to be a little more susceptible to disturbance than generalists and be at a greater overall rate of extinction risk. And as opposites to that, generalists kind of possess all the same qualities, but at the other end of the spectrum. So they have more broadly applicable anatomy. They aren't usually constrained to certain relationships in their ecological network. You'll find them in wider ranges and more kinds of habitats, and they're generally more resilient to disturbances, and they might even benefit off of disturbances, which is why a lot of the time you will see invasive species described as being generalists. So I think it's really easy to see what specialization is when you look at a system that's really specialized. So what you're seeing here are sundews, or members of genus Drosera, and these are carnivorous plants that are really highly evolved for basically all of the things that you'd expect to see in a specialist. They have really specialized anatomy in the form of these adhesive snares that they use to catch a meal. They are predatory plants. They have very restricted habitats. You're only going to find these guys in sphagnum bogs or other highly acidic and wet environments. They have, sorry, I misspoke there. So they have this very highly specialized anatomy in the form of these leaves and high flower stalks that come way off the base of the plant because you don't want to kill your pollinator, right? But it's clear to see that these species are specialized. So you might describe them as what I would call an unambiguous specialist. Because if you said this species is specialized, no one's going to fight you on that. But now consider another example. This is one that you might know because it grows around here. This is wild ginger. And this is an upland forest plant. It grows low to the ground in these large bunches. It has a fairly large range, and it makes these peculiar flowers that are very low to the ground and are evolved to attract carrion insects like gnats and flies that are looking for corpses. And just ask yourself, take a moment to think, would you call this species a specialist or a generalist? And there's probably people around the room that are thinking this is obviously a generalist, right? It's got this massive range and it doesn't really have any anatomy that's too peculiar. And there's probably people that are thinking the opposite, where this is obviously a specialized species because of these strange flowers, right? They're growing low to the ground and they're made to tailor specific insects. But maybe a better question to ask when you're thinking about this is, who cares about even doing that? Because even if we came to a conclusive answer that we all agreed upon, if we went outside the room and told someone that wild ginger is a specialist, that doesn't really tell them anything, because the terms are so broad that when you reduce them down to that binary designation, they don't really mean anything anymore. What you're seeing here are poll results from people who were asked how likely an event is depending on how you describe it. So if I said that something is apparently going to happen, what is the percent chance that it actually occurs? And you'll notice that they tend to have peaks where most people are in agreement. Most people would think that definitely means something's going to happen all the time. But you'll also notice that these are hills, right? There are people that don't agree with the peak. And one that I think that is pretty comical is with never. You'll see most people think that never is 0% of the time, which to me makes sense. But you also see a lot of people saying that never can be as high as 75% of the time. And you might ask yourself, what were they thinking, right? When they answered this poll, how is never 75% of the time? And what I think is important to consider is context. Because if I told you something like, my friend would never hurt anybody, you know I'm being serious, and you know they'd never lay a finger on someone. But if I said something like, Alex is never going to go clubbing with you, he's probably not, but it still sounds like there's a chance that he might, right? And that's a funny linguistic ambiguity, right? But this isn't something that you want in a scientific system like ecological studies and studies based on specialization and generalization. But that's kind of how these words get used. So what you're seeing here are some headlines on studies that concern themselves with systems that these labs are determining to be specialized or generalized, or supposedly specialized. That one's my favorite right there. But you'll notice a few things. The first is that most of these studies are in animal systems. Specialization and generalization get brought up a lot when you're talking about animals. And that's kind of reflected in titles, because they'll usually pair these designations with what that animal's eating. So, you know, you might be a ant-eating specialist, or you might be a specialist herbivore that only eats certain plants. But that's kind of an issue for a couple reasons. The first reason is that most animals are eating something, and just anybody can say that you are a X specialist depending on what you're eating, and it's not really saying anything. Another thing that is an issue is when you're talking about plant systems, because despite the sundews that I just showed you, most plants aren't eating things, which I think most people are familiar with. So how do you make a system that works for all different walks of life? And how do you make a framework of specialization that's more standardized and gets rid of that ambiguity? Well, what if I ask you to consider the wild ginger again in relation to two more species? So on the left here, you have Shumard's oak, just your run-of-the-mill plain old oak tree. And on the right here, you have ghost pipe, which is a native to this region. It's a non-photosynthetic parasitic plant with a very restricted life cycle. And you won't see it for most of the year. But what you'll find is most people come to the natural conclusion that this is the most specialized species on the right here. This is the most generalized species on the left. And wild ginger is probably somewhere in the middle. And earlier we asked ourselves, who cares about assigning these designations in a vacuum? Well, it becomes useful if you have something to compare to, because we said that specialized species are thought to be more threatened. So if you can make a good system of indexing specialization, you can get justification and kind of pick out species that are more critical for conservation efforts. Because if we know that this species is comparatively more specialized than these two, from a conservational standpoint, we can say, we probably don't have to worry about this species. We might want to take a look at this species. We should probably put some protections in place for the ghost pipe. And really kind of the main gist of the problem is that specialization is made up of too many different things, which is where this ambiguity comes from. But standardizing systems like this isn't impossible because you see other teams do it for other similar concepts, like what is a dominant species? And this is a really nice paper that I referenced quite a bit for my thesis. You'll also see people do the same thing in specialization, which is what we're talking about. But a problem that a lot of these systems run into is that they're not practical anymore. They talk about this topic so much and they get so in depth with it that the terms again kind of become useless because they're so convoluted that you can't apply them with any practicality. So now that I'm done complaining about specialization, what did we do about this problem? And we had two main goals with this. The first was we wanted to make a framework that would standardize the process, make a simple system to rank specialization in a way that removes any bias from the individual, because we don't want some people to think that a species is specialized while others think that it's generalized. But we didn't just want to stop there. We wanted to take these rankings that we were going to produce, and we wanted to look at specialization from an evolutionary standpoint. And we will find is a lot of studies that are concerned with evolution or specialization will only consider one or two species at a time. And that's kind of an issue because when you don't take in the bigger picture, more sister taxa and the evolutionary history, you might come to false conclusions that you wouldn't have otherwise if you had a bigger data set. And as far as how specialization acts, again, it's made up of a lot of different topics, right? Some of those things are morphological characteristics, and some of those things are more conceptual and behavioral. So does specialization organize itself across evolutionary space as more of a functional trait, or does it follow a different kind of emergence pattern? And again, this is something that isn't really looked at a lot, so we wanted to answer those questions. So we know we want to make a framework. What do we want it to do? In a nutshell, we want it to use observable real-world metrics because we don't want it to be biased. We want it to make a simple, one-dimensional final output that we can use to look at other studies or other species. And we want it to make biological context clear. Because again, we don't want to know, or we want to remove ambiguity surrounding these designations. Because sometimes a species that's specialized compared to other species near it isn't a specialist when you look at the bigger picture. So we want to know what biological level we're considering when we make these rankings. And before I continue on with that, I want to do a little detour into something that ecologists in the room might be familiar with. This is Grime CSR triangle. And what this is a method for conceptualizing a species strategy, where you will place a species somewhere in this triangle, and it's interpreted as being more adapted for the things at the tips, depending on how close it is to those tips. So a species up in the top of the triangle would be really adapted for biological competition. A species in the bottom right is going to be more adapted for stressful environments. And a species in the bottom left is more of an R strategist, or a species that's hoping to cash in on disturbances through higher rates of reproduction, maybe at the cost of the quality of the offspring. And species can fall anywhere in this triangle, at any position, not just at the tips. So another way that you can interpret this is that species in this red area in the middle are more generalized species that aren't super committed to one strategy, and species around the border are more specialized for individual strategies, either very adapted for competition, very adapted for stress, so on and so forth. But this is kind of a problematic system too. The first reason this is kind of an issue is because it's really broad. This system was designed to work with any plant. And that's nice because plant systems usually get overlooked for these kinds of studies. But it's nice because it'll work for any plant, but you lose some detail that you would otherwise get if you worked in an individual study system. Maybe the bigger reason that this is problematic, though, is that position on a triangle is a two-dimensional metric. And if you want to do statistical tests and you want to do phylogenetic analyses, you can't really use a two-dimensional metric on those. Most of them are built to work with continuous variables, usually continuous numeric variables. So we kind of know what we want to do. We want this framework, to be standardized, non-ambiguous. We talked about that already, right? So then what we did was we wanted to pick a study system. And we wanted a study system that was not uniform, because we wanted to make a framework of specialization to generalization. But if you look at a clade that only has species that are all doing the same thing, you can't really make an index on those differences, right? Because there wouldn't be any differences. We wanted a study system that was biologically relevant, so a species that would be important and have lots of data available. And we wanted that study system to be well understood, so that when we drew conclusions from our data, we had lots of work to compare it to. And we settled on Quercus, which is oak trees. And that was for a few reasons, but namely because they met all the criteria we just listed. So what you're seeing here is a figure of species diversity in US and Mexican forests. And you'll see that among all of the major tree genuses, Quercus is dominating in both US and Mexico in terms of overall species diversity. This is a similar chart that compares US and Mexican forests, but this time it's on the proportion of total biomass. And you'll again find that Quercus is kind of at the top in both kinds of forests. So it's making up the highest number of species and the highest amount of biomass. So it's definitely biologically relevant. Oh, we're going the wrong way here, sorry. Quercus is also diversified and spread across nearly the entire world. So what you're seeing here are all the different ranges and places that you can find Quercus species coded by the different subsections, subgenuses. And you'll find that even in North America, which is mostly where our study is focused on, Quercus have spread to almost all reaches of the continent, down all the way through Central America and into South America. And what you're seeing on the right here are ecoregions. And these are places where environmental conditions are more or less the same throughout. And you'll notice that Quercus species have kind of spanned into all of these different places. So why this makes Quercus a good model system is because to spread across all of these different kinds of regions, they likely had to speciate, specialize in some manner that we can measure, right? This probably makes Quercus non-uniform. We also had a lot of data available for this genus. So what you're looking at here is some of our geographic data. This is about 150,000 samples that we used to get range and habitat data across the United States, obviously. So now that we had our study system, we kind of had to figure out, well, what do we actually want to measure, right? We know we want to do oaks, but there's so many different features about oaks that you could look at. How do you narrow it down in a way that's still practical, but doesn't lose its representation of specialization? Because remember, specialization is made up of a lot of different things, and we don't want to mitigate that, but we don't want to make our system super convoluted either. So the first thing we did was look through the literature. So what you're seeing here are studies that concern themselves with specialization as a concept, not individual species level specialization. And what you'll see are these 4 categories, and we pretty much look to see what papers we're thinking were important related to specialization. So if they mention these factors related to specialization, we mark that with an X here. And what you'll find is that most of these publications seem to think that your habitat preferences and your anatomical features are number 1. Those are the most important things regarding how specialized you are. You'll also see threat level brought up a ton. And once in a while, you'll see interspecies interactions, which is that, how co-evolved are you? How reliant are you on other members of your network? And these are the 5 metrics that we decided on for oaks. And if you don't know, what these are at the moment, we're going to go through them one by one here. So the first metric that we looked at was extent of occurrence. And pretty much what this is you look at all the samples you have for a species, geographically laid out, you draw a polygon around them, like you can see here for species A and species B, and then you take the area of this polygon. And this is a good way to get a rough estimate of a species range size. And this is also a standardized method that gets used by the IUCN and the EPA. We wanted to also look again at these ecoregions and see how many unique regions each species was in. So take like Quercus macrocarpa, for example. If it only appeared in this red region here, that would be a 1. It's only in one unique region. But if it's across this whole country, like Quercus macrocarpa was, it might get something like 53. It's appearing in 53 different regions. And we were using that as a proxy for habitat restriction. So if you were in a lot of these environments, you were interpreted as being more of a generalist. We also wanted to look at plasticity, because plasticity is thought to be important, especially for generalists. So this is pretty much how much variation an individual can show or adapt to their environment. And we were looking at functional leaf traits because that's kind of the most important thing for plants in terms of expanding into new environments and things like that. And again, it's a measure of individual variation. So a tree that has very uniform leaves would be less plastic, whereas a tree with lots of different types of leaves will be more plastic. And we measured that using this equation that compares the maximum values of traits to the minimum values of traits. Something interesting that we found was that these plasticity traits tend to correlate really highly with one another. And what you're seeing here are two of those functional leaf traits we were looking at correlated by their plasticity for each value on the y and the x-axis. So this is by the species. Again, our axes are plasticity, and this colored circle is the strength of the correlation. And in this case, darker colors are stronger correlations. And this is a matrix of all of the plasticity traits compared to one another. And you'll see that the correlation between every single one of them is positive. So what you can kind of gather from that is that a tree that's plastic for one functional leaf trait is usually on average plastic for all of them. The fourth metric we looked at was the unique number of interspecies interactions for each species. So basically what we did for this is we used this tool called Globine. And this is an indexing tool that searches about 7 million different records over about 700,000 taxa. And what it does is you give it a species, so you might say like Quercus alba, what is it interacting with? And it'll produce a whole list for you of known interactions with that species. So if it has a specific pollinator that is known to visit it, or a particular fungus that it's always found to grow with, that will be listed on this database. And we wanted to know how many of these interactions each species had, because again, specialists are thought to be more reliant on these species to species interactions. Finally, we wanted to look at Domatia presence as a representative for specialization of anatomy. So what Domatia are these hairy little chambers that some oaks will produce between their leaf veins. And kind of the adaptive value of this is if you make these structures in your veins, these microscopic little mites will inhabit them and act as a symbiotic inhabitant of your leaf, because the mite gets shelter in the form of this housing, and the oak tree gets the benefit of the mite eating fungus and other microscopic herbivores. And we scored this for each species with our simple ranking scale here, and we looked at 3 leaves for every species. And we had 141 species in total that we looked at. So once we had all these metrics together, how did we actually score? And we used a form of percentile-based scoring, where a species value for each metric was compared to the value for all the other species in the study. So if you take extent of occurrence, for example, the range of values here was, I think the lowest species had an extent of occurrence of about 1,500 square kilometers, and the highest was about 7 million square kilometers. So there's a pretty high range here. But basically, we wanted to see where each species fell within that range. And then you were assigned points towards being specialized depending on where you fell within that range. So if you had a really high extent of occurrence, you're probably more of a generalist. You're getting less points towards being specialized for that category. We did the same thing for each metric, for each species, and then totaled them to produce a final ranking of specialization. So in this case, our Quercus not really our example species, this is more of a generalist. It has a really high range, it's in a lot of different regions, it's very plastic, and it's not showing these specialized traits. So it's not earning a lot of points towards being specialized. And this is nice for a few reasons. The first is that this is a continuous numeric variable. So you can use this for all sorts of statistical and phylogenetic analyses like we do later. And it's also nice because it makes that biological context clear, because we know this species is highly generalized compared to all the other species that we've looked at. So we know that this species is highly generalized compared to the 141 species we looked at. So you don't have to do any sort of guessing games as to what this thing is specialized or not specialized compared to. We didn't just take those rankings at face value and assume they were correct, though. We wanted to compare them to a couple control data sets to make sure that there was some validity in those results. And we compared those to two data sets, the first of which was an expert survey we conducted. And we sent surveys out to all sorts of Quercus experts, people that would be familiar with oaks. And we asked them, how specialized do you think X, Y, Z species are? And we didn't prompt them at all. We didn't tell them how to answer. We didn't tell them what to use to answer. We just wanted to know what they thought for each species. Our second data set was IUCN data. And you might be familiar with these if you've ever heard of a species referred to as critically endangered or threatened or vulnerable or things like that. So the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has a standardized system for ranking species based on their threat level. And again, the thinking is that specialized species are more threatened. So if you can make a framework to rank specialization, there should be some correlation here where more threatened species should also tend to rank more highly on a metric-based system. So before we get into talking about those results, I just want to detour real quick, because we did a model selection process, an AICC model selection process on these metrics to determine which were the best predictors of the two aforementioned data sets. And what we found was you get the most efficient model if you cut out the presence of domatia. Oh my God. If you cut out the presence of domatia entirely and you drop a couple of your plasticity metrics, you get a better system. You can also make a predictive system that's a tiny bit more efficient than ours if you drop everything but plasticity metrics. We didn't do that because if we only had plasticity metrics, this scoring is no longer representative of specialization, it's just the total plasticity score. For species that were data deficient, so maybe we're missing some data for one of these values, they had their remaining metrics, I hate this thing, they had their remaining metrics adjusted to compensate. So this was out of 100 total points, where each of these was equally weighted at 25. If you were missing, say, this fourth column here, your three remaining metrics would get adjusted to 33% of the total. And we found that data deficient species tended to score a little bit higher than their well-represented relatives. So what you're seeing here are significance tests between those three sets of data. And these results were surprising to me because I thought the experts were kind of going to be full of it. I didn't expect to see any significant trends between the experts, partly because of things like that figure I showed you before, where people don't agree on what words really mean. But what we actually found was a significant correlation between all three of these groups. And I'm going to take you through kind of, pairwise here one at a time. So what you're seeing here are the survey results. So the survey scores by species correlated against the metric-based specialization rankings. And you'll see that there's a significant relationship, a positive relationship between the metric-based scoring and the survey-based scoring. So there is some agreement between what experts think about specialization and what actual real-world metrics would suggest about specialization. And this is interesting because then you start to think, well, what were these scientists, what were these experts thinking about when they answered these questions, right? Were they identifying some kind of common thing to use in their designation? Or, what were they thinking when they did these things? Because we didn't tell them what to think, obviously. We went ahead and we correlated these survey results to all the metrics individually. So not just the metric-based rankings in total. And what we found is you actually get the best correlation when you compare these survey scores to just the extent of occurrence. So kind of my working theory is that scientists were probably asked about a species, looking that species up, sort of looking on the internet at their ranges to kind of get an idea and use that as a proxy of how specialized they were. The experts also were a little bit biased towards specialization. And on average, they were ranking species as about 12% more specialized than our metric-based system would suggest. So again, there might be some bias there where scientists have some preconceived notion about species, and that's bleeding into their designations. What you're seeing here are both the survey results and the metric-based rankings compared to a species threat level. And what you'll find is the same pattern in both. So this lettering is a connecting letters report that denotes significant difference. And what you see is that whether you're looking at the metric-based scoring or the survey-based scoring, the species of least concern and the threatened species are significantly different, suggesting that both asking experts and doing objective metric-based approaches are probably good systems of identifying species that might be at risk. So that's kind of the part one of this two-parter, where we wanted to make this framework, rank specialization, and then validate those results. But we also wanted to look at these evolutionary and geographic patterns, right? Because again, we don't really know how specialization organizes itself in a phylogenetic tree across evolutionary space. Our theory for this is that as generalists move into new environments using their broadly applicable strategies, they become localized and they eventually evolve into the specialized populations that you see in the current day. So what you're looking at here is a phylogeny of all 141 species that we considered. And these bars at the tips represent their metric-based ranking specialization, with bars that extend more to the right, bigger bars being more specialized species. And the color coding here is representative of the native region of these species. So black bars are Eurasian species, maroon bars are Eastern North American species, and so on and so forth. So the first thing that we wanted to do was look for any significant phylogenetic signal, or how strong was the influence of these relationships on the values you see at the tips. So we looked for Bloomberg's K and Pagel's lambda, which are related phylogenetic signals that tell you similar things. But in a nutshell, they are telling you how strongly the shared history of species is affecting the value of their specialization at the tips. And what we found with the K in red and lambda in green here is that for both tests of phylogenetic signal, the signal is weak to moderate at best. And basically what that's telling us is that while shared relationships, historical evolutionary history are playing a part in how specialized these species are, it's not as strong as you'd expect under Brownian motion. So there has to be something else at work here influencing these rankings specialization. And I think it's easier to see what that is. Oh, I'm going out of order here. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. So a couple patterns that you can see on this tree are easier to see when you look at things by region. The one that I think is the most striking is this really special or generalized cluster of species in the Eastern North American species down here. And all of these sister taxa are some of the most generalized species in the study, the ones that are pictured over here on the right. Eastern North American species tended to be very generalist overall, but that didn't mean that there wasn't Eastern North American specialists either, like this species here, Quercus pointonii. And I was kind of proud of the framework for picking out this species as a specialist, because this is actually the only critically endangered species in this entire group of 141 trees. So I was kind of proud of that one. In the Eurasian species, you see something similar, where they are tending a little bit towards generalization, but they're kind of hanging around this midpoint 50. Similar story in Californian species here. but they tend a little bit more towards specialization. They average at about 55, or just ever so slightly specialized. And then the Mexican species are interesting because most of the highly specialized species in this study come from these Mexican and Central American regions. But within this region, you also see a lot of generalists too. You see the most species in this region overall. Initially, people thought that Mexico was kind of the origin point for all oak species because there's so many of them there. So this is what I was hinting at earlier. I think it's easier to see the trend when you put it on a map. So what you're seeing here are the ecoregions of North America, color-coded by the mean specialization rankings of the species that appear in that region. And what you see is that as these values get darker, as specialization gets higher, the colors kind of get darker as you get away from Canada and the eastern parts of North America. So you see a fairly clear trend of increasing specialization as you move down into Central America and into Mexico. And I think this makes a lot of sense when you consider the evolutionary story of this, this group of species as well. Because about 40 million years ago, when the first Quercus ancestor arrived in North America, this is sort of the pathway that it took throughout this continent. So they kind of started up here and then migrated down along the coasts into these increasingly different, warmer, and more comparatively extreme regions. I think it's also interesting to look at this trend when you consider the number of species that are in each region too. Because you can see there is a similar trend with darker colors down here in Mexico. But there's also darker colors here on the East Coast too. And you can see again, there's a lot of unique species that occur in Mexico and Central America. And this is probably due in part to how much different the environment is from the ancestral territories. So species were forced to speciate and adapt and radiate at a greater rate that they otherwise would have had to do for the more tame Eastern North American regions. We thought that this might be connected to water availability. So what you're seeing here is the precipitation of Mexico, where more blue, cooler colors represent more rainfall, and these hotter colors represent less rainfall. And you'll notice that Mexico kind of does it all here. There are regions with lots of water available. There are regions with almost no water available. And this water is very seasonal. I know it's hard to make out the individual months, but these bars down here are each a month of the year and how much of that rain falls in each month. So you'll see that the water availability is very seasonal, with some months being very wet and some months getting almost no rainfall at all. And we tested that. So what you're seeing here are our metric-based rankings compared to the precipitation seasonality that that species experiences. And what you'll see is that as precipitation gets more seasonal, gets more extreme, these metric-based rankings also go up, indicating that this water stress, this availability of water, is having an impact on the level of specialization of each species. I had also mentioned that we had some theories kind of on how specialization is organizing itself. And again, we tested that. So what you're seeing here is an ancestral character state reconstruction, which basically takes our values of specialization from the tips and estimates what the ancestors were doing using that data. So again, this is a tree of about 40 million years in age. And what you'll find is that even though you have groups of extremely generalized species like these in Eastern North America, and groups of specialists like you see in some of the Mexican species, color-coded by this bar here, there isn't actually any significant shifts in those values. Or otherwise what that means is that despite these clusters where the pattern looks different to us, it's not actually statistically significantly different. And what you see is that if you go back 1, 2 nodes, the ancestor is almost always estimated to be a very slightly generalized species. which supports kind of our initial thinking that this genus is maintaining some level of generalization, expanding into new territories, and then specializing it once it gets into these increasingly different places. So kind of to summarize here, everything that we found, the first was that whether you're using a metric-based approach or you're asking experts that are familiar with species, both are pretty good systems of picking out what species are at risk. And which system you would want to use would probably come down to how many species you were looking at. If you wanted to do a big clade level analysis like we did, you might want to use a metric-based approach because no one wants to answer a survey with 141 questions, which we found out the hard way. Again, we also found that experts are good at picking out these specialized species, but they are a little biased. We didn't really have any good way to test what that might be other than looking at correlations between our metrics, but something is influencing them to significantly rank species as more specialized than metrics might suggest. We also found that data deficient species tended to be more specialized and therefore probably more at risk. So we would recommend that any similar system that you just give the data deficient species kind of like extra attention, so to speak, towards conservation. We found that specialization generalization is slightly tied to inheritance, but phylogenetic history is definitely not the driving factor in specialization. So it's not acting like a traditional morphological trait, like tail length or foot length or something like that. It seems to follow more of an emergence pattern that's tied to the environment. So we find that specialization is more of an emergent property of a place rather than something that gets inherited like a traditional feature. And we have a hunch that that is related to water availability. Again, we think that these species overall, at least in Quercus, are coming from a moderately generalized ancestor. So it seems like some level of generalization is preserved or maybe preferred within this clade. And then the specialized species radiate off of that later. And finally, considering a changing climate, you might want to give even more attention towards species that are already specialized. Because as precipitation becomes more seasonal, as weather patterns become more extreme, species that are already specialized are going to be even more threatened. And species that aren't currently threatened might start evolving towards specialization to cope with the changes and therefore become more threatened later. This was definitely not a solo project. I have lots of people to thank, but I'm not going to sit here and read through all of them with you. And other than that, that is about all I got. I'll take questions. Is it about the tie?
So going back to the classification model a bit, I know when you were trying to optimize it, you took out the.
You can keep talking. I'm just going.
Okay, yeah, you took out the one sort of specialist feature. I can't quite remember with the mites. What was that called?
Yeah, having domatia.
Domatia?
It's singular domatium, plural domatia. It's a duck.
Okay, so I know you took that out when you were optimizing it. Did you try also maybe like distributing the weights to the different categories at all?
Yeah, so we did play around with these weightings a fair bit actually. And at first we just started off with equal weighting between everything. And then we started trying combos where extent of occurrence and ecoregion presence were weighted as more heavily. But after we did the model selection process, we found that just an equal weighting between the metrics that it had picked out was the best between all of the systems that we tried. But again, if you take out everything but like 3 of these plasticity metrics, the model gets something like, I think it's like 3% more efficient, which isn't really worth losing all the other metrics we didn't feel.
How ready would you say the system would be to like go to different species?
It's pretty readily adaptable to any other clade. The trick is just picking what metrics you'd want to use, because you couldn't use domatia presence, on a species that doesn't make them. So you would just have to be careful to pick representative metrics for the clay that you were looking at. The kind of the bittersweet part of this is that since these rankings are made relevant to everything you looked at, it's not as useful for a like clade to clade comparison, because the most specialized oak tree might be a generalist compared to any sundew, right? So you kind of have to take more of a conceptual approach as far as clade to clade analysis is concerned.
So, how do you know that it's the expert bias and not something that you not included in your model?
So you're saying that maybe the metric-based approach is ranking them lower than they should be, as opposed to the opposite.
It could be.
It could be.
I mean, you've got some discordance there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're biased unless you're absolutely certain that there's something that you're not including that present in your model.
I think mentally, maybe I would have just been assuming that the metric-based approach would be the comparison point because it's the more tangible of the two. But it very well could be that the experts are right and the model doesn't rank high enough.
I mean, and the other thing is, each of those experts may have been considering other parameters in here. So you may have as many different criteria as you do have experts and models.
Yeah, and the experts themselves might only be using one thing that they looked at for 2 seconds too. So I'm sure you could do a whole series of studies on just what these experts were thinking when they answered. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I was just curious as regards to the basis of the term bias. That's all.
I guess it would be that people can be biased, whereas it's hard for the numbers to be biased. In the human sense, I guess.
Well, okay, well, let me just introduce a little bit of arrogance here, but it's the people that put the numbers in the model.
Well, yeah, I definitely could have my own biases too, which you just noticed.
So your concluding slide, you had that last point that changing climate that might impact on this, like the precipitation, like we talked about it. Another thing, I don't know whether that has an impact on that, like CO2 concentration. It is also changing. I don't know if that has an impact on that species or not.
Well, I know CO2 availability and acquisition is really important, like between C3 and C4 plants. So I would imagine if the environmental conditions like precipitation and temperature are changing, that would be the natural next step. And that would also be a factor that's changing as well.
Yeah, they're all kind of hand in hand. You start talking about CO2 and precipitation and Nabisco and all that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would say, like, bottom line, the environmental condition is changing. And in order to cope with that, they're either going to change or die, right? There isn't really any other options. So. Seems like it's about everybody.
Oh, Sorensen?
It's
Oh, it's clapping.
Thank you. Yeah,
Let's get
thank
out
you.
of here. It's time for the Inquisition.